Today, citizens across this state needed to hear a message of hope. The elderly, the unemployed, families in mortgage distress and households struggling to survive needed to see actions to inspire confidence. And you needed to take decisions to give some relief to families and workers who have been battered by your austerity budgets over your time in government. But today you have let the people down, as we witness again the actions of a government that is arrogant, out of touch and utterly indifferent to the devastation that a cocktail of cutbacks, unemployment and emigration has had on our society. Now, the sight of finance ministers taking to their feet on a message of hardship to deliver tough medicine to the citizens is now, it seems, an annual Fine Gael and Labour Party event. And your constant refrain of fairness serves only to underline just how unfair your government is. In fact, it's nothing short of astonishing to hear you use and abuse the vocabulary of fairness, because many terms could be used to describe your policy over the past years in government. Many words can describe your vicious austerity budgets, but, gentlemen, fairness is not one of them. Tá méadú sustach agus méadú scanrúil tucha linn na daoine a bhfuil stracailt lena cuid morgáistí is clán atá fága gan pingan rua ag deireadh na míosa. Tá na daoine seo tíirseach agus tá siad ag phullaint, tá sus uhu. You see, a fair budget would have given low and middle income households a break by putting money back in their pockets. But your targeting of low and middle income families has been relentless. Your attack on the living standards and spending power of the average citizen has been ruthless, and your assault on basic social protections has been calculated and it has been cruel. And it sits notably side by side with an absolute determination to protect the wealthy and wealth itself. Having listened to the twin ministers for hardship, Mr Noonan and Mr Howlin, I can only conclude today that this government is determined to leave struggling households in their despair and to force many thousands more of our young people on the emigration path. And yet you seem to live in a world of make-believe, applauding yourselves for what you call tough decisions, congratulating each other for the bravery of your stance. So, for the sake of clarity and for the record, you need to know that families who can't heat their homes, couples that can't make their mortgage repayments, and parents who Skype their children in Sydney and Boston won't be joining in your chorus of self-praise. People across the state and those in enforced exile will now wonder whether recovery is actually possible on your watch, because it's now clear that you don't have a plan for economic growth, no plan for employment or for debt relief, and you clearly have no clue at all about the provision of decent public services. And what makes it all the worse is that today in this Dáil you question whether or not you even care. You're almost 3 years in office, 3 long years, and the truth is that people haven't seen any real improvement in their living standards. In fact, the experiences of people who are sick and who have had their medical cards taken away, people with disabilities who have faced cut after cut, young jobless people and people at work, well, all of them see no prospect for improvement. And your legacy right now is one of hopelessness, absolute hopelessness. The citizens of this state couldn't have been clearer in the mandate that they gave you in 2011. And you knew what that mandate was. They voted for change. Well, what they've gotten is more of the same. Today marks the point where almost €30 billion has been bled from the economy. Economic growth stands at 0%, 0.2% for this year. That's the minister's boast. Unemployment at 13.3%, with a long-term unemployment rate of 60%. Now, it hardly needs saying, but perhaps it does to yourselves, that this is not a success story. Far from it, no matter what way you try to spin it. Today's budget, to borrow a word from an Taoiseach, delivers another almighty wallop to the people. And you know, the real tragedy and the real scandal of all of this is that it doesn't have to be this way. Because you have the option of giving real relief to struggling families. And Sinn Féin set out these costed alternatives in our fair budget proposal. Abolition of the tax on the family home. Substantial, meaningful assistance with school books costs. Help to heat the home. Extension of school meals. We put all of these measures on the table, and all of them were costed and deliverable. Sinn Féin's Budget 2014 proposals are truly fair because we have sought to give low and middle income families a break by putting money back into their pockets. You could have taken the almost 300,000 of the lowest paid workers out of the universal social charge net. You could have honourably reversed your cut to the respite grant and given carers a break. You could have called a halt to the constant ratcheting up of third-level fees. You see, all of these measures were possible, but you set your face against them. And we have to ask why that is. Is it that all the tea and sympathy rhetoric routinely spouted in the Dáil by government deputies is just bluff? Is that it? Or is it something else? Could it be that you, the government, hold the people in contempt? The social welfare budget is to be cut by €290 million, and Joan Burton and the great champions of working people in the Labour Party stand over this. Now, it's now abundantly clear that you have a real hang-up and a real problem about young people. I'm not sure what exactly they've done to you, but your cut of €44 per week to job seekers for people under 25 years of age requires an explanation, because in making this announcement, no rationale was offered up by the Minister. Is it that you think that the under 25s are a layabout generation? Is that your analysis? Have you noticed that there's no jobs for them? Or are you simply giving them yet another reason to emigrate and to become someone else's problem? Is that your analysis? I have to say that when I heard the Minister make the announcement, although it had been flagged in the media of this cut, I found myself thinking, well, what next? Wonder what we might expect next year. Perhaps the Economic Management Council will be offering to go and pack young people's suitcases and book their flights for them, even give them a few bob for their taxi fare to the airport. And let me tell you that people in that age group who have seen their friends en masse forced to leave this country because of your failures and Fianna Fáil's failures and the failure of politics in this state, they'll be thinking something along those lines, I reckon. But early or late, you'll have to give an explanation to those people, and not just the under 25, to their families, why it is you deem it appropriate to target them in this way. I can't think of a measure that could be seen as a greater incentive for young people to leave, and to leave very, very quickly, because their government of recovery and democratic revolutions, who are all about change, don't actually want them to remain resident in the state. That's how it looks to me, and I suspect that's how it will look to them. And of course, it's not just the cut to the job seekers' allowance that sends this message to that generation of people. Graduates face indefinite periods of rolling unpaid internships. In fact, Minister Howlin, who's not with us sadly, recently admitted to taking on 35 such young people in his own department. And yet not one of these young interns was offered a full-time position, despite similar recruitment needs arising. And just recently, the same minister, Minister Howlin, has hired again 3 additional researchers under the Jobs Bridge scheme, tasking them with the overhaul and simplification of the statute book. Now, I give you that specific example because I believe it speaks volumes about how this government views our young people. Because you are disinterested, you are dismissive, and you have no regard for them. And Minister Burton's coded language when it comes to the 25s and under who find themselves out of work is, in my view, reprehensible. You see, you seem to blame them for your failures. It is you who have failed to create the environment within which our young people can flourish. It's that simple. It is you who failed to create the environment in which jobs can be created. That's on your watch. And it is you who have cynically and deliberately created and sustained an environment for emigration. It's not just the young that are in your sights in this budget. Others have made reference to the cutting of the telephone allowance, which will affect, as we know, not just older citizens, but carers and people with disabilities. I'd love to know, or to have been a fly on the wall in that discussion, and how you arrived at the conclusion that that was a good idea. It'd be really interesting to know that it is terribly unfortunate that those cabinet discussions or economic management council discussions where the lads took this decision aren't available. Because I would be truly fascinated to know how anybody in their right mind would have considered that a good idea. To leave people who are in a vulnerable position, in a dependent position, potentially without access to a telephone. Is that a good idea, Taoiseach? Does that strike you as clear thinking? Judging by the expression on your face, perhaps not. But the difficulty, pardon me? Please. So you removed the telephone allowance from older people. This is going to cause them huge distress and grief. And you also end then the bereavement grant. Now, I could hear the sighs from people on this particular issue, because you probably know, I imagine you know, from your own constituency, that the issue of the cost of burials has loomed large for people for a very, very long time. It is very, very expensive to bury a loved one. And the bereavement grant gave people just some. The bereavement grant gave people some modest intervention and modest assistance for it. But you're so mean-spirited, you are so horribly mean-spirited that you take even that away from it, from people. The average cost. And it's higher in Dublin. It depends on the part of the world, the country you're in. In the social welfare cuts, you've also made cuts to invalidity pensions. Now, Taoiseach, I'm sure you read the budget book the same as myself, and I am sure that you realise, because you are standing over these cuts, that cuts to the invalidity pension for those under 65, those over 65 with qualified adult dependents, will range, the cut on an annual basis will range somewhere in the region of €3,500 to €5,500. That is a huge wallop for those families. The cuts also to maternity benefit rates, and there's a refrain. First you tax maternity benefit, now you cut maternity benefit. Clearly your commitment to children is wafer thin, but you haven't done just that. You've also cut adoptive benefit. So you don't have to be a genius to figure out that these cuts will have a real impact on families, on new parents, many of whom, as we have already heard, are struggling and struggling badly. So much for the touchy-feely governmental approach to children and their parents. I think that your attitude to people who find themselves reliant on a welfare payment stinks. Your attitude stinks. And if you imagine for a second that people are living it up on their payments, on a payment of €188, for example, per week, can I suggest and can I challenge anyone in the Dáil, Minister Noonan, Minister Howley, yourself, Taoiseach, yourself, Taoiseach, to give it a try and to see how you'd get by and how you might manage on such a small amount of money. And maybe that's what's needed here. A little dose of reality, a little taste of what it means to count not just the euros but the cents, day on day, week on week. Maybe that would shorten your cough. And maybe your Economic Management Council would take a very different view of how you analyse these matters and the decisions that you take budget on budget. The budget envisages a cut of $666 million from the health budget. Now, bear in mind that this is a department that routinely runs over budget, and Minister Riley, for all of his bluster, presides over that reality. Budget 2013, if you recall, contained €1.173 billion in full-year cuts. And at that time, Minister Howland just presented the blanket figure, and he gave very scant detail as to where specifically these savings would be found. And we see a similar occurrence in today's announcement. But your decision to extend the GP care to children of 5 years and under is welcome. We welcome that. But we do have to say that it can only be taken in the context of the removal of medical cards from thousands of very sick people. Now, you've tried to deny the fact, including yourself, Taoiseach, but it is a fact nonetheless that removing discretionary medical cards from cancer patients and children with complex medical needs is happening, and it is causing real hardship and distress. James Riley, when he's challenged on this, tells the cameras that these people have fallen through the cracks. I don't know who he's kidding. Katie Connolly is aged 5. She's from Cork, and she's fallen through the cracks, as the Minister would have it. Katie has Down syndrome, asthma, a heart condition, juvenile arthritis, and Katie has been denied a medical card or a GP visit card. That's Katie's story. And a response from government to say that she and her family have fallen through the cracks is simply not acceptable. Of course, the decision to grant care to the under 5s also has to be taken with the reality of a proposed £130 million cut to medical cards themselves. And I want to get the term right. I believe in the book it's referred to as medical card probity. Medical card probity. That, of course, is code for medical card cutbacks. So we have the absolutely bizarre situation where your government, over the last 48 hours or more, has sought to court public popularity on a suggestion of granting medical cards to young children, all the while GP cards to young children, all the while you're cooking the books and working up a strategy to introduce massive cutbacks in the general provision of medical cards. I find that to be very, very perverse. Media reports, no doubt leaked by some of your own insiders, tell us that the extension of GP care for the under-5s will be delivered in the new year. But of course we know from past experience that there's no guarantee of this, because Minister Riley promised a GP card for all suffering with a long-term illness within the first year of government. And those people with long-term illnesses, with real and complex medical needs, are still waiting. They're still waiting for this promise to be kept. So Katie and all of the other Katies, the length and breadth of the state, need to be awarded their medical cards, and they need to keep them. Nothing short of that will suffice. The Minister earlier on made reference to mental health service provision and trumpeted the fact that 20 million is to be held in that regard for spending in that area. I'm surprised that the Minister is not aware that the all-party mental health group sought a further 35 million in that budget. And very often the mental health services are referred to as one of the Cinderella services within health. Let's just say it here today on Budget Day, 20 million is not enough. And I have to think that in making that decision, that the ministers concerned knew full well and know full well that they were cutting the cloth too tight, and that mental health services will remain under-resourced. And of course we know this happens at a time when mental health issues, not least deaths by suicide in this state, are at a really chronic proportion. The increase to prescription charges up to €2.50 per item with a cap of €25 is again a very mean-spirited cut. And all the more astonishing given that it's being introduced by people who fought tooth and nail against prescription drugs, prescription charges in a previous incarnation. And I just wonder, in the interests of joined-up thinking, did you consider when you were taking away the telephone allowance, and then when you were making this decision in respect of prescription charges, that would prove to be a hit on the double for so many people, older people, carers, people with disabilities? Did you join those dots, or is that not the kind of thing to do? Maybe you don't bother doing that sort of thinking, real live thinking in the Economic Management Council. Your government, and it's reflected in the figures today, has failed to realise the huge savings possible through the use of generic drugs and by driving value for money deals with the large pharmaceutical companies. And it's a real shame that more energy hasn't been dedicated to finding those real substantial savings in the system. You know, if you applied yourself to that piece of work more effectively, you could have kept your hands off people who rely on health and social supports. The reference in today's budget to the front line was really little more than the worst kind of gesture politics. We know that the front line is under unbearable strain. We know that waiting lists for surgeries and procedures grow. In fact, the HSE confirmed to me just this week that it can't provide physiotherapy services to school-aged children with disabilities. That would be school kids over the age of 5 in the northwest Dublin region. And the waiting list for children under the age of 5 is over 2 years. Similarly, waiting lists for speech therapy for children are as high as 2 years. And you know, there's no joined-up focus between departments. So today's 3-year-old who needs speech therapy is tomorrow's 5-year-old who needs a special needs assistant, because the necessary and minor intervention was not made early on. It bears all the hallmarks of bad governance. Tánaiste that today third-level students and their families have been hit again in today's announcements. To add to the insult of the Susie debacle, we have the injury of hikes in registration fees, and your ongoing assault on third-level students and their families, let it be said, has meant and will mean a real struggle for students to stay on and to graduate from college. Add to this the people who have been denied access to further education because of underfunding, of students returning to education and underfunding of postgraduate students, and we can correctly measure your commitment to the knowledge economy and economic recovery. I also notice that you are going to cut social welfare payments to people who take up FOSS courses, and that you're going to end the long-term unemployment bonus paid to FOSS, VETOS and Youth Reach recipients. Hardly progressive, hardly the stuff of encouraging people into education, or dare I say it, into work. On the area of taxation, Fine Gael have once again had their way, and the Labour Party has allowed the burden of this budget, £1.6 billion in cuts, to fall on those living on modest incomes. Now, your government refuses to consider an increase in income tax on individual incomes over €100,000. You won't entertain or hear tell of the idea of a wealth tax on assets in excess of £1 million. In fact, your government becomes aggressive, becomes irrational when those ideas are even aired, because your government will not ask those who have more to pay more in a time of crisis. And the contrast between your sensitivity for those at the top is in stark contrast to your treatment of those in lower income brackets. You persist with the farce of taxing the family home at a time when almost 200,000 families find themselves in mortgage distress. And there was a time, you know, when Fianna Fáil was rounded on by Fine Gael and Labour when in opposition for protecting golden circles. It's now very clear that you pursue that same approach from the comfort of your ministerial offices. Public and civil servants have had their dose of tough medicine over the last series of budgets, and the Haddington Road Agreement is just the latest instalment in cuts and increased working hours for those workers charged with delivering essential services. Doing more with less is how the government spins it. And you know, it must be truly galling for public servants to see the outrageous pay and pensions still afforded to a tiny minority funded by the public purse. It must be infuriating for the average public sector worker to have their terms and conditions of employment lumped in with the discussion of payments to current and former Taoiseach, Secretaries General and Government Special Advisers. Enda Kenny, Eamon Gilmore, Michael Noonan, Brendan Howlin, the band of boys dedicated to cutting all round them are all overpaid. However, in their scramble to find savings, they seem to have overlooked this very simple reality. So can I encourage them to go back and to look at the international comparisons? And let me assure you, when you do, you will not be able to justify the salaries that you're on, and today's budget should have reflected that fact, and cuts should have been made accordingly. The so-called stimulus plan, or the $500 million of pro-business measures announced today, I think is little short of laughable. The key ingredient for economic recovery is investment. We're all fully aware of that fact. And on numerous occasions, we in Sinn Féin have set out for you plans and funding streams for the necessary scale of investment needed to impact on jobs recovery. But you've given us the deaf ear. You don't want to know. I believe that your single biggest failure, and you have many of them, but the biggest failure is the failure to invest at the required level for jobs. It's your single biggest failure. And half-baked schemes to massage the figures on the live register won't cut it. We need investment of scale. You've spent the last 3 years dithering and foostering about jobs and stimulus, talking a lot about it and failing abjectly to deliver any of it. And maybe that's what explains your anxiety to cut the under-25s. The safety valve for your political skin is to ensure that young people leave, and not so young people leave, because you can't provide the jobs and the opportunity here. You're happy, it seems, to leave the domestic economy crippled, literally crippled, by a double whammy of cuts to disposable income amongst those who spend most, low and middle income workers, and your inability to think strategically and to invest wisely. Now, you had no problem pumping funds from the National Pension Reserve Fund to prop up banks, but you singularly failed to deploy this fund of some $6.4 billion to get people back to work. You've announced issues around this fund on three separate occasions. You still haven't delivered it. You still have not. Don't come back in talking about it again until you are in a position to deliver it. Investment of scale to deliver significant employment and opportunities for our people and for our young people in particular. I was listening today to your friend, the German Finance Minister, Wolfgang Schäuble. Now, he's knocked any notion you may have had of a retrospective recapitalisation of the banks on the head. And my colleague Piers Doherty asked the question earlier. What happened, Taoiseach, to that game changer? And for all the talk about your bank levies, and for all the talk of progress and exiting the bailout, wouldn't it be a real scandal and a tragedy if the very people who are being cut and cut and cut again are left with the legacy of that $65 billion of bank debt? Wouldn't that be a scandal? Mr Schäuble had something interesting to say at Cathaoirleach. He said, when asked why would the banks not be recapitalised, he said, everything is fine in Ireland. He said that on the airwaves. Everything is fine in Ireland. I can only presume from that government have told Mr Schäuble and reassured Mr Schäuble that everything is just fine in Ireland. If only they knew the truth, if only you could speak the truth and act in the interests of the truth, because it's not fine. 1.6 billion in cuts to the most vulnerable, to the young, to the elderly, to people who are vulnerable is not fine. And no matter what way you spin it or dress it up, the people are alive to that reality.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Deputy. I now call